Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. As days passed, Mark began to adapt to his new life, a life so different from what he had ever known. The mansion felt empty, despite its grandeur. Each morning, he would wake up in the king-sized bed that Eleanor had provided, the soft linens feeling foreign against his rough skin. The house was silent, except for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of the staff moving about. It was a far cry from the cramped apartment he had shared with his mother before everything changed. At first, he had been grateful for the opportunity. The weight of his debts had been lifted, and his future felt secure. But as time went on, he began to feel the loneliness of the mansion, the emptiness that came with knowing his connection to Eleanor was strictly transactional. She never asked for his company unless it was for an event, and even then, they spoke little. It was all business, nothing more. It was on a quiet evening that Mark found himself walking through the grand hallway, his footsteps echoing off the marble floors. Eleanor was in her study, as usual, working late into the night. He paused by the door, hesitant. He had been living with her for weeks now, but it felt as though they were still strangers. There had been no talk of feelings, no sharing of personal stories. Their interactions were limited to business meetings and social gatherings. It was a strange arrangement, one that had started to feel more like a prison than a solution. Mark leaned against the doorframe and sighed. He could hear the soft clicking of Eleanor's keyboard through the door. His mind wandered back to the night they had made the deal. At that moment, he had been desperate, and the offer had seemed like his only way out. But now, he found himself questioning if he had made the right choice. Could he really continue living in this sterile, emotionless world? He had signed up for financial security, but at what cost? After a long pause, he knocked gently on the door. Eleanor looked up from her work, her expression unreadable. "Mark," she said, her voice cool but not unkind. "What's on your mind?" Mark hesitated, unsure how to express the thoughts that had been plaguing him. I just wanted to check in," he said, his voice softer than usual. "How are you doing?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the question. She leaned back in her chair and studied him for a moment. "I'm fine," she said simply, returning her gaze to her screen. "I've always been fine." Mark felt a pang of disappointment. She had always been guarded, but tonight something felt different. He took a step closer to her desk, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "Is this really all we're going to have? A deal? No real connection?" She paused, her fingers resting on the keyboard. For a brief moment, Mark thought she might say something, but she didn't. Instead, she looked up at him with a calm expression. "This was never about connection," she replied softly. "It was about survival. I need someone to help me secure my legacy, and you need financial security. There's no room for anything else." Mark stared at her, his heart heavy with unspoken words. He knew this was the truth, but it didn't make it any easier to accept. The distance between them felt more like a chasm every day, and he wasn't sure how long he could keep pretending it didn't bother him. As the days went on, Mark threw himself into his work. He attended meetings, helped Eleanor with business strategies, and began to immerse himself in the luxury that surrounded him. But none of it filled the emptiness he felt inside. Eleanor remained a distant figure in his life, a woman who had saved him but kept her heart locked away. One evening, as he was walking through the grand garden that stretched behind the mansion, Mark received a text from Eleanor. It was short, just a simple message asking him to join her for dinner. No explanation, no pleasantries, just a demand. He hesitated for a moment, then sighed and made his way to the dining room. When he arrived, Eleanor was already seated, her expression as unreadable as ever. She greeted him with a nod, and they both took their seats. The conversation during dinner was as dry as usual. They discussed business matters, the upcoming charity gala, and other such topics that felt more like duties than genuine discussions. Mark couldn't help but feel a deep sense of frustration. It was clear that this arrangement wasn't working for either of them, but neither knew how to change it. They were both trapped in the roles they had agreed to play. As the evening wore on, Mark's mind began to wander. He couldn't keep pretending that this was all he wanted. He needed more. He needed to feel something real, something that went beyond business and obligation. He looked up at Eleanor, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the chandelier above them, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. Could he find a way to break through the walls she had built around herself? Could he prove to her that there was more to life than just security? Mark pushed his plate aside and looked directly at Eleanor. "Eleanor, I know this wasn't part of the deal, but I want to do something for you," he said, his voice steady despite the emotions stirring within him. "I want to build something. Something that shows you how much you've helped me. Something that proves we're not just two people stuck in an arrangement. I want to build a hospital." Eleanor's eyes widened slightly, her mask of indifference faltering for a moment. "A hospital," she repeated, as though she hadn't heard him correctly. Mark nodded, his resolve firm. For a long moment, Eleanor didn't speak. Mark could see the wheels turning in her mind, and he wondered if this gesture would be enough to finally break down the walls between them. The dinner ended quietly, with Mark's offer of building a hospital hanging in the air like an unspoken promise. Eleanor didn't respond immediately. Her gaze drifted to the table, her fingers lightly tapping the edge of her wineglass as she seemed to weigh his words. Mark sat across from her, his heart pounding. He had taken a huge step by suggesting such a thing, but now, with the silence stretching between them, he wasn't sure if he had done the right thing. Was this a gesture too far? Was she even capable of understanding? Finally, Eleanor looked up, her expression unreadable. "You want to build a hospital," she repeated, her voice measured, as though testing the idea in her mind. Mark nodded, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Yes," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It's the least I can do. You've given me a chance when no one else would. This is how I can give back, by helping others who are struggling just like I was." She stared at him for a long time, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You don't understand," she said softly, almost to herself. "A hospital isn't just a building. It's a responsibility, a commitment. It takes more than money and good intentions." Mark's chest tightened at her words. He knew she was right, but he wasn't backing down. "I understand," he replied. "But I've learned that sometimes, the hardest things to build are the ones that matter the most." Eleanor's eyes softened for a brief moment before her usual cool demeanor returned. She took a deep breath, as though she had made a decision. "Fine," she said, her voice still calm but tinged with something else, a hint of emotion, perhaps, or maybe just exhaustion. "If you're serious about this, then we'll make it happen. But you have no idea what you're getting into." Mark felt a rush of relief wash over him, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of determination. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady. "Let's make it happen." The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. Mark and Eleanor worked together, hand in hand, to turn the idea of the hospital into a reality. They met with architects, gathered the necessary permits, and even began fundraising. The scale of the project was immense, but for Mark, it felt like the first time in months that he had a purpose beyond just surviving. Eleanor, too, seemed to change as they worked side by side. She was no longer the cold, distant woman he had first met. There was a fire in her eyes when they discussed the hospital, something that spoke to a deeper side of her that Mark had never seen before. Late one night, as they were reviewing blueprints for the hospital, Eleanor finally spoke up. "You know, this isn't what I expected," she said, her voice softer than usual. Mark looked up, surprised by the vulnerability in her tone. "What do you mean?" he asked. Eleanor hesitated, then sighed. When we started this, I thought it was just going to be another business deal. But I can't deny that I'm starting to care about this. About the people who will be helped. About you. Mark's heart skipped a beat at her words. Could this be the moment when things truly began to change between them? Could they build something real, something beyond the walls of their contract? But before he could respond, she added, but don't get any ideas. This isn't some romantic gesture. This is business. And don't forget, you're still just fulfilling your end of the bargain. Mark smiled softly, understanding the walls she had put up. I haven't forgotten, he said quietly. But that doesn't mean we can't make this work. And so, as the days turned into weeks, the foundation for the hospital was laid both literally and metaphorically. The building began to take shape, and so did the fragile bond between Mark and Eleanor. They were still bound by their agreement, but something deeper was growing between them, something neither of them could ignore. One evening, as they stood on the roof of the construction site, looking out over the city skyline, Mark felt a sense of peace settle over him. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the right path. And as he glanced at Eleanor, standing beside him, her gaze fixed on the horizon, he realized that this was more than just a hospital. This was the beginning of something far more significant, a new chapter in both of their lives. We're doing something good here, Mark said quietly, his voice full of conviction. Eleanor turned to look at him, and for the briefest moment, their eyes locked. It was a look that said more than words could. A look that spoke of trust, of partnership, and maybe, just maybe, of something more. But neither of them said anything else that night. They simply stood there, together, watching as the city below them pulsed with life, both knowing that the future, uncertain as it was, held a promise they had never imagined. The weeks passed in a blur of construction, meetings, and progress, but despite the growing success of the hospital project, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The connection he had hoped for with Eleanor was still just out of reach. She remained as distant as ever, her emotions guarded behind the walls she had built long before he entered her life. Mark had learned to accept their arrangement, but deep down, he knew he wanted more. He wanted her trust, her heart, not just her business acumen. One afternoon, as they were reviewing final plans for the hospital's opening, Mark couldn't keep his thoughts to himself any longer. Eleanor, we've come this far, he said, his voice steady but laced with frustration. We've built something incredible together. But it feels like we're still stuck in the same place. This thing between us, this deal, it's just not enough anymore. Eleanor looked up from the plans, her eyes narrowing slightly as though bracing for what was coming next. What are you saying, Mark? She asked, her tone cautious, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a vulnerability she rarely allowed to show. Mark leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest. I'm saying that I can't keep pretending that this is just a business deal. I care about you, Eleanor. I don't just want your help, I want you. And I know you feel something, too. The room went silent as Eleanor processed his words. She stared at him, her lips pressed into a thin line. Mark couldn't tell if she was angry or just lost. After what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke. You don't understand, Mark. This was never about feelings. It was about securing a future. My future. You've been a means to an end, and I've helped you because you needed it. But don't start thinking that this is anything more than that. Mark's heart sank. Her words stung, but he couldn't back down now. He had come too far. I don't care about your wealth, Eleanor. I don't care about your legacy. I care about you. And I can't keep living like this, pretending like we're just business partners. I want to be more than that. He stood up, his hands trembling slightly as he walked over to the window. He didn't know what he expected to happen, but he knew that he couldn't continue in this cold, emotionless arrangement. Eleanor was more than just a businesswoman to him now. She had become someone he wanted to be with, someone he cared for deeply. Eleanor remained silent for a long time, her back straight and her face unreadable. Mark turned to look at her, his gaze softening. I don't know what I'm asking for, Eleanor. But I can't keep pretending that what we have isn't more than just a contract. It's never been just a contract for me. Finally, Eleanor stood, walking over to where Mark stood. She didn't look at him immediately, instead focusing on the city skyline outside the window. "You're right," she said quietly. "It's never been just a contract. I've tried to keep it that way, but maybe I've been fooling myself." Mark felt his heart lift slightly, though he was still unsure of where this was heading. Eleanor turned to face him, her eyes meeting his for the first time in what felt like forever. "I've never let anyone in, Mark. Not since everything changed." Mark took a step closer to her, his voice soft but earnest. "I'm not asking you to change everything. Just let me in. Let me show you that we can have something real, something more than just a business arrangement." Eleanor's eyes softened, but the walls were still there, thick and impenetrable. "I don't know if I can do that," she whispered, her voice almost breaking. "I've spent my life building walls around my heart. I don't know how to tear them down." Mark reached out, gently touching her hand, the warmth of his touch sending a shiver through her. "Let me help you," he said softly. "Let me be the one to show you that love isn't a weakness. It's not something to be afraid of." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt charged, as if something monumental was about to happen. Eleanor's gaze flickered to Mark's hand, still resting lightly on hers, before finally, she gave a small, hesitant nod. "Okay," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you have to promise me something. You have to promise that if this doesn't work, we won't let it destroy us. We'll still have the hospital, the legacy. We'll still have something." Mark smiled softly, relieved. "I promise," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "But I believe we can have both. A future. A real one. Together." And in that moment, Mark knew that the hospital project wasn't the only thing they were building. They were also starting to build something far more important: trust, connection, and a future they could share. It was a slow and uncertain journey, but it was one they were finally ready to take together. As the days passed, Mark and Eleanor began to find a rhythm that, while still fragile, was becoming more genuine. The walls that once stood between them started to crack, and for the first time, they truly saw each other. Their partnership was no longer just about fulfilling an agreement, it was evolving into something more. Mark focused on the hospital project, working tirelessly alongside Eleanor to ensure that everything was on track for its grand opening. Despite the business-driven nature of their collaboration, Mark could feel a subtle shift. Eleanor was opening up, albeit slowly, and Mark was determined to be there every step of the way. One late evening, as they sat in the grand office overlooking the city, the weight of the project was beginning to take its toll on both of them. The stress of the hospital's opening was intense, but it wasn't just the work that was exhausting Eleanor, it was the emotions she had been keeping at bay for so long. Mark watched as she rubbed her temples, her usual confident demeanor faltering for just a moment. "You okay?" Mark asked, his voice soft, a stark contrast to the usual tone of their business talks. Eleanor paused, looking up at him, her expression weary. She hadn't expected him to ask, let alone care. "I'm fine," she replied quickly, but Mark could tell she was far from it. Her usual sharpness had softened, and for the first time, he saw the vulnerability that she tried so hard to hide. "Eleanor," Mark said gently, his gaze fixed on her. "You don't have to carry all of this by yourself. We're in this together, you know." She shook her head, her eyes distant. "I've spent my entire life handling everything alone, Mark. It's hard to let someone in. It's hard to trust anyone, even you." Mark's heart ached at her words. He stood up, walking over to her desk, placing his hand gently on hers. "I know it's not easy," he said, his voice sincere. "But we're partners in this, Eleanor. In more ways than just the hospital. You don't have to do it alone anymore. Not unless you want to." Eleanor looked at him, the weight of her past and the walls she had built around herself clear in her eyes. But for the first time, she didn't pull away from him. Instead, she allowed herself to soften just a little. I don't know if I can do this, she whispered, the admission raw and real. Mark squeezed her hand. You don't have to do it all at once. Just, take it one step at a time. There was a long silence between them, the kind of silence that spoke volumes. For the first time, Mark felt like they were standing on equal ground, no longer bound by a contract, but by something more genuine. Eleanor wasn't just the woman who had offered him a way out of his financial troubles, she was a woman who had been through more than he could ever imagine, and perhaps, in this moment, she was finally letting him in. Later that evening, as they sat together, reviewing the final touches for the hospital's opening gala, Eleanor glanced at Mark. I've been thinking, she said quietly. Maybe I've been wrong about everything. Maybe I've been too focused on legacy and control. Maybe what really matters is what we do for the people we care about. Mark smiled softly. I think you're starting to understand what I've been saying all along. They spent the next few days preparing for the gala, their first real test of what their partnership could become. As they worked side by side, Eleanor's walls continued to come down. She was no longer the distant businesswoman who had hired Mark out of necessity. She was someone who was beginning to understand the value of human connection, of trust, and of love. The night of the gala arrived, and the grand hall was filled with guests from all walks of life. The hospital was about to open its doors, and the event was both a celebration and a culmination of all the hard work they had poured into it. Eleanor stood at the center of the room, her confident exterior on display, but her eyes kept drifting to Mark, who was standing at the edge of the crowd, watching her. As the evening went on, Mark and Eleanor shared a quiet moment away from the hustle and bustle of the gala. He took her hand gently, leading her outside onto the balcony. The cool night air was a welcome relief from the warmth of the crowd inside. The city stretched out before them, a sea of lights twinkling in the distance. You did it, Mark said softly, his voice filled with admiration. You really did it. Eleanor smiled, her usual reserve slipping away as she looked at him. We did it, she corrected. I couldn't have done this without you. Mark's heart swelled with pride. I think we've only just begun. And for the first time in their partnership, Eleanor let herself believe him. She smiled, her hand gently squeezing his as they stood together in the quiet of the night, ready to face whatever the future held. They weren't just building a hospital anymore, they were building a future, one they could share together. As the days passed after the gala, Mark and Eleanor found themselves navigating uncharted waters. The hospital project was a success, and the opening was just around the corner. Yet, there was something else growing between them, something that neither of them had fully expected. The connection they shared, once purely professional, had blossomed into something deeper, more personal. Mark couldn't help but notice the change in Eleanor. She was no longer the icy, untouchable woman he had first met. She had begun to open up, letting him in ways that were both unexpected and beautiful. One evening, as they sat together in Eleanor's office, reviewing final details for the hospital's opening day, Mark could sense the tension in the air. Eleanor had been quieter than usual, her brow furrowed in thought. He glanced up at her, sensing something was on her mind. What's going on? He asked, his voice gentle, trying not to push too hard. You've been distracted all evening. Eleanor didn't immediately respond. Instead, she set down the papers she had been reviewing and leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the window overlooking the city below. For a long moment, she remained silent, and Mark could feel the weight of her thoughts in the air between them. Finally, she spoke, her voice slow and hesitant. I'm scared, she admitted. I've spent my entire life protecting myself, protecting everything I've built. I've never let anyone close, never allowed myself to need someone, to trust them. But, now I find myself wanting that. Wanting you. Mark's heart skipped a beat at her words. He knew Eleanor's past had been one of isolation and control, but hearing her admit that she wanted something more, that she wanted him, was something he hadn't expected. He stood up, walking over to her, his voice calm but full of emotion. Eleanor, you don't have to be scared. I'm not going anywhere. I've wanted this too, wanted you. We don't have to rush it. We can take it slow, figure this out together. Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes filled with vulnerability, something she rarely showed. "I'm not sure I know how to do this," she whispered. "To trust, to let go of everything I've built up." Mark smiled softly, reaching out to take her hand. "We don't have to have all the answers right now. We've already built something incredible together, this hospital, this partnership. That's more than most people ever have. And we'll figure the rest out, one step at a time." For a long moment, they simply stood there, holding hands, the weight of their words settling in the quiet room. It wasn't a fairy tale, but it was real. It was a beginning. Eleanor gave a small nod, as though making a decision in her heart. "Okay," she said softly. "One step at a time." As the weeks went by, Eleanor and Mark began to grow closer. The trust they had built through their work on the hospital project had laid a strong foundation, and now, they were slowly beginning to explore what came next. Eleanor was no longer just a business partner to Mark, she was someone he cared for deeply, and he could see that she felt the same way. The opening day of the hospital arrived, and it was everything they had worked for. The building was filled with people, doctors, nurses, volunteers, and members of the community, all gathered to celebrate the grand opening of a facility that would change lives. As they stood together, side by side, in the lobby of the hospital, Eleanor looked at Mark, her eyes shining with pride. "We did it," she said, her voice full of emotion. Mark smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "We did it," he echoed. "And this is just the beginning." The day was filled with speeches, ribbon-cutting ceremonies, and congratulations, but amidst the excitement, Mark and Eleanor shared quiet moments, just the two of them, watching their dream come to life. They had built something tangible, something that would make a difference in the world. And in that moment, Mark knew that they had also built something just as important, a future together. Later that evening, as the event came to a close and the last of the guests began to leave, Mark and Eleanor stood outside the hospital, the cool night air surrounding them. Eleanor turned to him, her eyes soft. "I never imagined this. I never imagined feeling this way, about you, about us." Mark took a deep breath, his heart full. "Neither did I. But I'm glad we're here, together." For the first time in what felt like forever, Eleanor smiled, a real smile, one that reached her eyes. "Me too," she said quietly. "Me too." And as they stood there, together, watching the stars above, they knew that this was just the beginning. They had built more than just a hospital. They had built a life, a partnership, and the possibility of something real. And that, in itself, was more than they had ever dreamed. The weeks following the hospital's grand opening were filled with a sense of accomplishment, but for Mark and Eleanor, there was still a lingering question: what came next? They had built a hospital together, but now they had to figure out how to navigate their evolving relationship. They had both opened up in ways they never expected, but there were still moments of uncertainty. Eleanor, in particular, found herself grappling with the vulnerability of trusting someone again, especially after a lifetime of maintaining control over every aspect of her life. As they spent more time together, their connection deepened, but so did their fears. Eleanor wasn't used to letting go. She wasn't used to needing someone, especially not someone like Mark, who had come into her life under such unusual circumstances. One evening, after a long day of meetings and site visits for future projects, they sat in Eleanor's office, the city lights twinkling outside the window. Mark was flipping through a stack of papers, his mind still on the work ahead. Eleanor, however, was quieter than usual. She had been distant the entire day, and Mark couldn't help but notice the way her gaze seemed lost in thought. He set the papers down and looked at her, his voice soft. She didn't immediately respond. Instead, she ran her fingers along the edge of her desk, her eyes still distant. Finally, she sighed, meeting his gaze. Mark nodded, understanding more than she realized. "I get it," he said. "We've come a long way, but sometimes, things are still hard to figure out. We're not perfect, but we're in this together." Eleanor looked at him, her expression softening. "I never expected to be in this position," she admitted. "I spent so much time building walls around myself, protecting my heart. But now I don't know what to do with it." With us. Mark stood up and walked over to her, gently placing his hand on hers. Eleanor, he said, his voice steady. You don't have to have all the answers. We don't have to rush. Just, let me in. One step at a time. I'm here for you, and I always will be. For a moment, Eleanor simply stared at their hands, the warmth of his touch grounding her in the moment. She had spent so long being independent, being strong, that allowing herself to be vulnerable felt like an insurmountable challenge. But something about Mark's unwavering support made her believe that maybe, just maybe, it was worth taking the leap. I'm scared, Mark, she whispered, her voice barely audible. What if I let you in and everything falls apart? What if I can't do this? What if I end up pushing you away? Mark's heart clenched at her words, but he squeezed her hand gently. You won't push me away, he reassured her softly. And even if things get tough, we'll face it together. This isn't about perfection. It's about finding something real. Something worth fighting for. Eleanor's eyes filled with emotion as she took a deep breath, letting his words sink in. For the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope. She had been so afraid to let anyone in, but maybe Mark was the exception. Maybe this was the beginning of something she hadn't dared to dream of. Mark smiled softly, his heart swelling with relief. He leaned down and kissed her forehead gently. I'm with you, Eleanor. Always. And in that moment, Eleanor finally allowed herself to believe it. She didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time, she was willing to face it with Mark by her side. The walls she had spent years building were slowly starting to crumble, piece by piece. And in their place, something more beautiful was beginning to grow, something she couldn't yet name, but she was ready to discover. As the days turned into weeks, Mark and Eleanor's relationship continued to evolve. They still had their challenges, but there was a new sense of hope in their hearts. They were no longer just partners in business, they were partners in life, slowly but surely, learning to trust, to love, and to build a future together. The following months brought change neither of them could have predicted. The hospital flourished, becoming a symbol of hope for the community, and Mark's leadership quickly earned respect from everyone on staff. Eleanor, once the cold and distant businesswoman, had transformed too. She smiled more often, spoke with warmth, and seemed to rediscover parts of herself she had buried years ago. But despite the happiness they had built together, there was still one thing left unsaid between them: the truth about how much they had come to mean to each other. Both of them felt it, but neither had yet found the courage to speak it aloud. One chilly evening, the hospital held a charity gala in honor of its first successful year. The grand ballroom glowed with golden light, filled with laughter, soft music, and the sound of champagne glasses clinking. Eleanor looked breathtaking in a deep emerald gown, and Mark couldn't take his eyes off her all night. Yet beneath the surface of the celebration, he could sense that something was weighing on her mind. When the speeches ended and the crowd began to mingle, Mark quietly approached her, his voice low. You've been quiet tonight, he said softly. Is something wrong? Eleanor hesitated before meeting his gaze. I was just thinking, she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. About how far we've come. About how much this place means to me, to us. She paused, taking a breath. When we first met, I thought what we had was just a transaction away to secure my legacy. But somewhere along the way, it became more. You became more. Mark felt his chest tighten as he listened, the emotions he had been holding back finally rising to the surface. Eleanor, he said, his voice trembling slightly, you changed my life. You gave me a second chance when I had nothing left. But more than that, you made me believe in something again, in love, in partnership, in building something real. For a moment, they stood in silence, the sounds of the party fading around them. Then Eleanor reached out, her fingers brushing against his. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't met? She asked quietly. If you hadn't walked into that bistro that day? Mark smiled softly, shaking his head. No, he said. Because I believe everything happens for a reason. I was meant to meet you, Eleanor. Maybe we both needed saving, just in different ways. Eleanor's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for the first time, she didn't try to hide them. "You're right," she whispered. "Maybe we both did." As the evening went on, Mark took her hand and led her to the balcony, away from the noise of the crowd. The night air was cool and crisp, and the city lights shimmered below. They stood together in the quiet, the world seeming to fall away. Mark turned to her, his voice low but full of conviction. "Eleanor, I don't want to keep pretending. I love you. I've loved you for a long time." Eleanor's breath caught, her heart pounding. She had spent her entire life building walls around herself, but in this moment, she felt them crumble completely. "I love you too, Mark," she said softly, her voice trembling with honesty. "And I'm done being afraid of it." Mark smiled, pulling her close, his arms wrapping around her as if to shield her from everything that had ever hurt her. "Then let's stop being afraid," he whispered. "Let's start living for real this time." Under the glow of the city lights, Eleanor leaned into him, and for the first time in years, she felt whole. It wasn't about deals or contracts anymore. It was about love, real, imperfect, unconditional love. And as they stood there, holding each other close, they both knew that this was the beginning of their forever. Months passed, and the hospital continued to thrive, serving as a testament to the hard work and vision that Mark and Eleanor had put into it. The bond between them, once tentative and fragile, had become a strong foundation. They were no longer just business partners, but a true team both in their professional lives and in their personal one. They had faced their fears, broken down the walls they had each built around themselves, and discovered something real, something lasting. Mark and Eleanor had become more than they had ever imagined. One quiet morning, after a particularly successful fundraiser for the hospital, Eleanor sat in her office, looking out the window at the city that had become a symbol of her growth. She had spent so many years focused solely on her career, on building her empire, but now, as she looked at the life she had created with Mark, she realized that she had built something even more valuable: love and partnership. Mark walked in just as she was lost in thought, a soft smile on his face as he leaned against the doorframe. "You look like you're a million miles away," he said, his voice light and teasing. Eleanor smiled back, her eyes softening as she looked at him. Mark moved toward her, taking her hand gently in his. "We've come a long way," he agreed, his gaze locking with hers. "But we've still got so much ahead of us, together." Eleanor's heart swelled at his words. She had never thought this was possible. To have someone who truly understood her, someone who shared her dreams and her fears. Someone who had been with her through it all. "You're right," she said softly. "There's still so much more to do. But I'm not afraid anymore. Not with you by my side." Mark smiled, his heart full. "I'm not afraid either. We've already done the impossible. And now, we get to build the rest of our lives." And so they did. Together, Mark and Eleanor continued to build their dreams, brick by brick, not just for the hospital, but for each other. They traveled the world, discovering new places and experiences, growing together in ways they had never expected. The hospital became a beacon of hope for the community, and the legacy they had created together was not just one of success and wealth, but of love and dedication. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Mark took Eleanor to a quiet park overlooking the city. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the horizon. Mark stopped in the middle of the park, turning to Eleanor with a smile that made her heart race. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice soft but sure. "We've come so far, but there's one thing I haven't done yet." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, curiosity lighting up her eyes. "What's that?" Mark took a deep breath, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small, velvet box. "I've been wanting to ask you this for a while now," he said, his voice steady despite the nerves in his chest. "Eleanor Brooks, will you marry me?" Her breath caught in her throat, tears welling up in her eyes as she looked at the man who had completely transformed her life. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you." And in that moment, as Mark slipped the ring onto her finger, they both knew that this was only the beginning. Together, they had built a hospital, a future, and a love that would last a lifetime. They had faced their fears, broken down their walls, and created something beautiful from the ashes of their pasts. And now, they were ready to take on the world side by side. The end.